Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Glad to be here for this one. It's going to be intense.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want you to just imagine standing in the center of the O2 Arena in London. Usually this place is, it's deafening with rock music or pop concerts. But tonight, thousands of people are sitting in absolute silence.
Yeah, paying rock star ticket prices, too.
Right. And they're watching what is basically a clash of titans. It is a battle between pure rationality and ancient wisdom. And the core tension we are looking at today is massive. Can we live moral, meaningful lives without the stories of religion? Or does removing God inevitably lead to a dangerous void, like a vacuum that just gets filled by nihilism and totalitarianism?
It's the ultimate high-stakes question.
It really is.
Yeah.
And unpacking this dense, high-energy conversation between Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and moderator Douglas Murray is our mission for this deep dive.
And it really is a unique cultural moment to have all these people, just to hear three men talk about the metaphysical foundations of value. On one side, you have Sam Harris, the neuroscientist. He's really playing the role of the learned atheist here.
Right.
His stance is incredibly clear. He thinks religion consists of bad ideas. It's basically bad software that humanity has outgrown, and we need to delete it before it crashes the entire system.
And then in the other corner, you have Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist. He's the psychological pragmatist in this dynamic. He is not arguing that the Bible is true in the same way a chemistry textbook is true.
Exactly.
He's arguing that these religious stories are this deep evolutionary substructure. And that substructure is what keeps the human psyche and, honestly, society itself from just falling apart.
And sitting right between them is Douglas Murray. He's the moderator. And he's essentially asking the big question, if we kill God, do we also kill the West?
It's a heavy setup. Before we get into the first round of this fight, I have to say, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
It definitely does.
Now let's get right into the ring here. Harris throws the first punch, and it's honestly a pretty weird one. He starts talking about astrology.
I know, it seems like a pivot, but it's actually a brilliant tactical move. Harris pulls the audience. Remember, there are thousands of people there, and he asks who believes in astrology.
Just a show of hands.
Right. He points out that out in the general public, something like 25% of people genuinely believe the position of Jupiter determines their mood or their fate. He is setting a trap here.
How so?
He's saying, look, astrology has been around for thousands of years. It's ancient. It's practically universal. Basically, every culture has looked up at the stars and made meaning out of them. But does that make it true?
Ah, so he's attacking the idea that old automatically equals wise.
Precisely. It's what philosophers call the genetic fallacy. Harris is arguing that just because a belief system helped our ancestors survive, or, just because it brings us comfort today, that doesn't mean it accurately describes reality.
Like thinking the earth was flat.
Exactly. That was a useful belief for a long time, right up until it wasn't. Harris says we have beaten astrology into submission with actual science, with astronomy, and his point is we should do the exact same thing with religion.
But Peterson doesn't just take that lying down, and this is actually where I struggled a bit with the source material, so I'm hoping you can help me out here. Peterson actually defends astrology in this moment. Is he saying he believes in daily horoscopes?
No. And this is where you really have to put on your Peterson translator. He is not saying Geminis are moody. He defends astrology as a nascent science.
A nascent science?
Think about alchemy. Before we had chemistry, before we had the periodic table and exact formulas, we had alchemy. It was this messy mix of magic, trial and error, and human intuition. But you cannot get to chemistry without going through alchemy first.
So he's saying astrology was just the rough draft of astronomy.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
Peterson argues that humans project their imagination onto the unknown. The stars are the ultimate unknown, right? So we project stories onto them to orient ourselves. He calls it a poetic fantasy.
Poetic fantasy, I like that phrase.
It's a good one, because the human brain has to create a narrative, a story about reality, before it can pin down a hard scientific fact about reality. So for Peterson, the fantasy isn't just a lie, it's the necessary scaffolding you have to build in order to eventually construct the truth.
Okay, I see that. I see how he's framing it. But Harris's point still kind of remains, doesn't it? Like, we don't need the scaffolding anymore. The building is finished. We have the Hubble telescope now. We don't need to wonder if Mars is angry at us because we had a bad harvest.
And that is the exact crux of their disagreement. Harris is basically saying, distinguish fact from fantasy and grow up. But Peterson replies, If you tear down that fantasy, you might find out that the cold, hard facts aren't enough to keep you oriented in the world. And honestly, this leads perfectly into the weirdest part of the entire night.
Oh, the vision.
Yes, Peterson starts describing this profound vision he had.
Yeah, this was trippy to read about. He describes a vision where he's interacting with the spirit of the Father.
And then it goes deeper. He interacts with ancestral spirits and then eventually God.
Okay, we need to unpack this carefully because if I am Sam Harris sitting on that stage, I am definitely thinking, okay, this guy is just hallucinating right now. But Peterson doesn't stay in the mystical realm. He pivots straight to biology. How exactly do you get from the spirit of the Father to human biology?
It is a fascinating intellectual leap. Peterson grounds this mystical, almost shamanic vision in evolutionary psychology. He argues that for millions of years, human beings, and he specifically focuses on men in this context, organize themselves into hierarchies of competence.
Okay, so to survive, you had to actually be good at things.
Right. Hunting, building shelter, fighting off predators, leading the tribe.
Standard survival of the fittest stuff.
Exactly. But here is the key question. Who decides who is fit? Peterson argues that women were the primary selectors. Women selected mates from the very top of these competence hierarchies.
Because that guaranteed the best chance of survival for their kids.
Right. So over millions and millions of years, there is this relentless, continuous selective force that is weeding out the incompetent and rewarding the competent.
So we are all basically the descendants of the men who were chosen by that process.
We are. Now imagine trying to summarize that immense selective force, that millions of years old biological wisdom of what works and what doesn't. How do you conceptualize that into a single idea?
And he calls that the spirit of the Father.
Yes. It is not a literal ghost. It is a representation of the fundamental pattern that created humanity. He calls it metaphysically fundamental because without that exact evolutionary force, we literally wouldn't exist.
That is a wildly sophisticated way to view God. It's almost like saying God is the base operating system of successful human survival.
That's a great analogy.
But, I mean, I've played the skeptic here for a second. Is that really what everyday people mean when they bow their heads and pray?
And that is exactly Sam Harris's main objection. He has a brilliant term for it. He calls this God smuggling.
God smuggling. I love that.
It hits the nail on the head for his argument. Harris accuses Peterson of pulling a bait and switch on the audience. He says Peterson is using this incredibly high-level academic evolutionary theory to justify concepts that, for 99% of the audience, just mean a literal magic man in the sky.
Right. Harris
Yeah.
says, Jordan, you are giving intellectual cover to fundamentalists.
Exactly. Harris is pointing out that the guy sitting in the front row of the arena isn't praying to a sexual selection hierarchy. He's thinking, see? The smart professor from Toronto says Jesus is literally real and listening to my prayers.
So Harris is arguing, you can understand biology, you can understand human hierarchy, and you can value all of that without believing that Iron Age books were dictated by the creator of the universe.
Yes. He thinks Peterson is being intellectually slippery here. He thinks he's using the language of science to protect the dogma of religion from valid criticism.
And this tension between a story being a useful evolutionary metaphor versus being a literal historical truth, that is the heartbeat of this entire deep dive. But from here, things get much, much darker. They move away from the stars and biology, and they head straight into the blood-soaked history of the 20th century.
Ah, yes, the tennis match of history. This is really where the glove come off.
They bring up Stalin, they bring up Mao, Hitler. The core argument here is, what actually happens when you kill God? What happens when a society completely removes that religious substructure?
Peterson and Douglas Murray are in total lockstep on this issue. They argue that the horrific atrocities of the 20th century, the gulags, the concentration camps, the mass starvations, they happened specifically because the West tried to remove God.
So the argument is that if you don't have God, there is absolutely no limit on the power of the state.
Precisely. If there is no higher moral power sitting above the king or the dictator, then the dictator effectively becomes God. And a human God is always a terrified, paranoid tyrant.
Because they have to maintain absolute control.
Right. They argue that religion provides this necessary, transcendent constraint on human power. You cannot just casually murder millions of people if you genuinely believe that every single soul is sacred to a divine creator. But if you think people are just random bags of meat and chemistry, well, you can do whatever you want with them.
That is a chilling point. But Harris, he absolutely hates this argument. He calls it a secular canard.
He is so tired of hearing it. Harris argues vehemently that Stalinism was not caused by atheism. He has this great line during the debate where he says, Stalinism wasn't caused by people reading too much Bertrand Russell or David Hume.
Right, because those are atheist philosophers. He's basically saying you don't see massive armies of skeptics marching into Poland in the name of doubt and rational inquiry.
Exactly. Harris argues that the root problem is not a lack of God. The problem is dogmatism. He says Stalinism functioned exactly like a religion in every meaningful way.
Let's break that down. How does a secular regime act like a religion?
Think about the structure. It had a prophet, which was Lenin. It had a holy book, which was Das Kapital. It had an infallible deity, which was Stalin himself. And most importantly, it had heretics.
Ah, so if you disagreed with the Communist Party, you weren't just politically wrong, you were morally evil.
Yes, you were an enemy of the truth. Harris is saying that the hardware of religion, that specific wiring in our brains that makes us want to worship authority and persecute non-believers, that hardware is still there, even if you change the software from Jesus to the state.
That makes a lot of sense. Harris believes the ultimate danger isn't atheism, it's the suspension of critical thinking. Whether you are bowing down to a pope or a general secretary, it is the act of blind bowing that eventually kills people.
That's his core thesis on history, yes.
Okay, but this is where Douglas Murray jumps back in as the man in the middle. And he poses a problem that I think a lot of our listeners might actually feel themselves. He basically says, okay, Sam, you have the logic on your side. You are right that we don't need God to explain why thunder happens anymore. But does logic keep you warm at night?
The void problem. This is a profound concern. Murray worries that while Harris might be technically right on the empirical facts, a Nature paper like a dry, peer-reviewed scientific journal article is not enough to motivate an average person to be good or to console them when they are grieving the loss of a child.
It is the stark difference between raw information and deep meaning.
And Peterson jumps all over this opening. He claims that pure rationality completely lacks motive force. He talks a lot about his clinical practice here, specifically treating soldiers with severe PTSD.
Right, people who have seen the absolute worst of humanity.
Exactly. He says you cannot heal a shattered soul with a spreadsheet. When someone has looked into the eyes of true malevolence, of pure evil, they need a concept of good that is just as deep and just as powerful to fight back against it.
So Peterson is saying we need these heavy, almost mythological concepts to deal with the extreme trauma of life. Rationality is just too thin of a shield.
That's his claim.
But Harris has a counterproposal here. He says we don't need the Bible for that. We have philosophy.
Yes, he brings up Stoicism. Specifically, he cites the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Which is a fantastic book, by the way. If you are listening and you haven't read it, definitely put it on your reading list.
It really is incredible. And Harris's point in bringing it up is to say, look, here is a book written by a Roman emperor nearly 2,000 years ago. It contains profound wisdom. It offers a recipe for a good life and incredible emotional resilience. And it does all of that without any of the religious dogma.
And without the baggage. Harris keeps bringing up the baggage of the Old Testament, the rules about stoning women for not being virgins, the rules endorsing slavery, the conflicting moral codes.
Right.
Harris asks, why do we need all those specific, violent, ancient stories to figure out how to be good today? Why can't we just use reason and love?
Harris genuinely believes we can distill the wisdom out of these traditions, like a software update. We can keep the good parts without running the buggy, outdated operating system.
Oh.
He argues that a life motivated by love and guided by reason is the ultimate goal, and you do not need a priest or a holy book to give you permission to live that way.
But Peterson has a sharp retort to that. He says that love isn't just some random chemical reaction. He tells Harris that when he talks about love and truth as these ultimate guiding principles, he is actually just smuggling religion back into the conversation under a different name.
Yes, Peterson argues that the value of love and the value of truth are not scientific facts. You cannot put human rights under a microscope and measure them. He says these are fundamentally religious values that the modern West inherited from its Judeo-Christian past. He thinks Harris is essentially sawing off the very branch he is sitting on.
And this back and forth leads to this incredible visual that Peterson paints for the audience. He starts talking about the architecture of a cathedral.
The cathedral dome. This is a brilliant rhetorical moment. Peterson asks the audience to visualize a classic medieval cathedral. He asks, why did peasants who were literally starving and desperately poor spend all of their money, their time, and their labor building these massive, towering structures?
And specifically, why is Christ usually depicted at the very top, at the center of the dome? It's an architectural question, but he gives it a philosophical answer.
Peterson interprets this entirely symbolically. He says the cathedral represents the fundamental structure of reality itself, and having Christ at the top of the dome represents the Logos.
Okay, we definitely need to define that word for the listeners. What exactly is the Logos?
It's an ancient Greek term. It is often translated simply as the word, but it means so much more than that. It essentially means truthful speech. It is the divine logic or action that generates habitable order out of pure chaos.
Okay.
So Peterson is saying that a society puts the Logos at the top of its architectural and cultural hierarchy because the highest possible ideal a society can have is a commitment to speaking the truth.
So by building the dome and putting that symbol at the highest point, they were physically saying, we subordinate everything else, our lives, our money, our kings, to the truth.
Exactly. And doing that creates a habitable order. If we ever stop speaking the truth, if we let go of the Logos, the dome collapses and chaos floods into society.
It is a beautiful piece of imagery. I mean, honestly, it's incredibly poetic. But Harris is not having it. He hits Peterson with what he calls the grandmother test. And this is really where the rubber meets the road in their debate.
The grandmother test cuts right through all that poetry. Harris basically asks, Jordan, that is all very deep and symbolic, but do you believe this stuff the way a grandmother believes it?
Right. Does he believe the Bible is literally true? Or is it just a really useful, fancy metaphor for truthful speech?
Harris points out that he could take his time and make those exact same deep structural arguments for Buddhism or Greek mythology, or going all the way back to the beginning of the night astrology.
You can find deep, profound meaning in Harry Potter if you look hard enough and apply enough literary analysis to it. Why does it absolutely have to be the Christian story?
And that is the friction point. Harris directly demands to know, do you believe the Bible was dictated by an omniscient being? And Peterson?
Well, he dances around it.
Oh, he dances hard. He completely evades giving a straight yes or no. He just says the Bible is a mystery. He says it was produced by a vast collection of human minds over thousands of years.
Which, to a hard rationalist and scientist like Harris, just sounds like a very long-winded, polite way of saying no.
Right. But Peterson won't actually say the word no, because he believes that that vast collection of human minds managed to tap into something genuinely deep, something transcendent. Peterson believes that even if the historical, empirical facts of the Bible are fuzzy or metaphorical, the moral truth embedding in it is absolute.
It really comes down to the difference between scientific truth like, did this physically happen in history, and evolutionary truth, which is, does believing this story help our species survive?
Mm-hmm.
They end up talking past each other a bit because they are essentially using completely different dictionaries.
They are, and realizing they are at a bit of an intellectual impasse, Douglas Murray steps in to ask a final, very personal question to close out the session. He asks both of them simply, what do you hate?
This part was so revealing. You really get to see their core worldviews crystallize in their answers. Peterson goes first.
And his answer is shocking. Peterson says he hates the part of himself that could be an Auschwitz prison guard.
Whoa! I mean, that is a heavy, heavy answer. Most people would say, I hate traffic or I hate systemic injustice. He looks inward and says he hates himself.
It fits his entire philosophy perfectly, though. Peterson believes that every single human being has a deep, latent capacity for pure malevolence. He believes the line between good and evil runs right down the center of every human heart.
Right.
He is terrified of that dark part of himself, and he uses religion and social structure and tradition as a cage to constrain that beast within. He truly thinks that if he lets go of that ancient structure, the Auschwitz guard comes out.
So his entire worldview is built around containing this internal monster. But Harris's answer to the exact same question was totally different.
Completely different. Harris says he hates unnecessary suffering, and he specifically zeroes in on pettiness.
Yeah, he talks about how human beings waste so much of their short lives just lost in the past or agonizing over the future. We get consumed by anxiety, worry, and regret.
Harris hates that we constantly miss the sacredness of the present moment. For him, the grand tragedy of human life isn't that we are all secret Nazis just waiting to break out. The tragedy is that we are asleep. We are distracted.
We're petty.
Yes. We miss the profound beauty of being alive because our minds are clouded by bad ideas and ancient dogmas.
It is such a stark contrast. Peterson is fighting a desperate war against the monster inside. Harris is just trying to wake us up from a bad dream.
And that contrast really summarizes the extreme difficulty of the middle ground that Douglas Murray was trying to find between them all night.
So bringing this all home, what does this actually mean for you, for the person listening to this right now on their commute or while doing the dishes?
It leaves you with the central dilemma of modern life. Harris wants to rip the Band-Aid of religion right off. He thinks the cultural wound has healed and the bandage is just getting gross and infected and holding us back. He wants us to face the world with clear eyes, using reason and love, and he trusts that humans are inherently good enough to do that successfully.
But Peterson looks at that exact same cultural wound and says, if you rip that bandage off, the patient is going to bleed to death. He thinks the void is real. He thinks that without the stories and the structures of the past guiding us, we will inevitably descend into chaos and totalitarianism.
It really asks you, the listener, to consider your own life. Are you holding on to traditions because you truly believe they are factual, or just because they are comfortable? Or, conversely, if you consider yourself a skeptic, are you truly ready to face the void? Do you actually have enough stoicism inside you to be good without God looking over your shoulder?
And here is a final provocative thought to leave you with. Something that really struck me while we were reviewing the sources for this deep dive. Peterson argues fiercely that we act out our beliefs. He says that what we consciously say matters far less than what we actually do in the world.
Right. You are what you act out, regardless of what you claim to believe.
So if a vocal, committed atheist treats his neighbors with deep love, constantly seeks the truth, and works to minimize the suffering of others, is it possible that he is actually being more religiously Christian in his actions than a believer who just goes to church on Sunday but judges and harms everyone around him?
That really is the ultimate question here. If you are acting out the logos in your daily life, does it even matter if you intellectually deny the label? Maybe the label of atheist isn't as meaningful as we tend to think it is.
Definitely something to mull over on your own. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a genuine pleasure exploring this with you.
We will see you next time on Thinking Deeper.